Many of you have asked me to do a video about cuttings. I don't know why it fascinates people, but I can understand why. It certainly fascinates me. When I was looking into the background of doing this video, I went round the nursery to see all the types of cuttings we do. And this is just a representative sample of all the cuttings that we produce at the moment and more. Now, why are people so fascinated by cuttings? Cuttings is simply a method of propagation, and most bonsai people are not just people who carve their trees and wire their trees. I like to think that most bonsai enthusiasts are also gardeners and horticulturalists. And when you are a gardener, one of the great joys of gardening is to be able to propagate things yourself. It's not just a question of saving money, because I know some very, very rich people who have loads of money. They can afford to buy the plants, and yet they will save every tiny scrap of material that they've pruned off and make cuttings from it. So it's not a question of saving money. It's just the fun of propagating for the sake of propagating. I remember when I was a small boy, I've always been interested in plants, and the joy and delight you get when you stick something in the soil and it grows into a new plant. When I was living in India, things like hibiscus, bougainvillea, and sugarcane. You stick a large, thick trunk of sugarcane or bougainvillea into the soil, and hey presto, in 2 weeks it forms another plant. And wouldn't it be wonderful if we as human beings could cut the tip of the finger off and stick it in a medium and it could become another person? It is like that, but plants have this unique property of self-propagating. That means you cut this material off, stick it in the soil or in some medium, and it will form another plant, and it will be the exact clone or copy of the parent plant. But I don't want to dwell too much into the realms of science fiction, but I can envisage maybe in less than 100 years, we're already talking of cloning, where you're taking the embryo of some cell of the human body and you can grow it in a medium and it becomes an exact clone. They've done it with sheep, so I'm sure you can do it with human beings as well. So it's not that far-fetched when you talk of propagating by cuttings. So cuttings is exactly the same thing. You're taking a bit of material and creating the self-same genes in another plant, another being. So, although they are another plant, is it part of the same being of the plant? I don't know. Let's not get into that. So, let's talk about cuttings. So, just a sample, there are junipers here, fig tree, Chinese elm, Cotoneaster, this is crabapple, more Chinese elm, miniature roses, zelkova, camellias, we make cuttings. This is the spruce cutting, Satsuki azalea, this is a 2-year-old cutting, and Itoigawa juniper, hinoki cypress, and so it goes on. You can make cuttings from virtually any and everything, but we've got to qualify that, because like the air layerings, not all plants grow from cuttings. Before we get into the detailed process of making cuttings, let me just mention that there are many, many types of cuttings. There are what we call softwood cuttings, there are semi-hardwood cuttings, and hardwood cuttings. What I'm going to do today is mainly about softwood and semi-soft or semi-hard cuttings, because those are the types of cuttings that we will use most of in making our bonsai. So let's begin by taking you through the different types of cuttings. Before I show you the actual process of making cutting, I would just mention that there is another type of cutting which is really an aside of this demonstration, and that is root cuttings. Now, these Chinese elms, or what is commonly sold as zelkova, it's not zelkova, it's Chinese elm, Ulmus parviflora, they are made from roots. When you root prune a tree, especially these Chinese elm, they have these thick, long, straggly roots. And if you just cut that root off and stick the head out, this is really a root. You can see all these new shoots will come. So you can make plants from root cuttings. So root cuttings are easily made from wisteria, and this is crabapple, again to show you that I'm not cheating. See, these are actually roots. You can see that they're roots. Stick the roots, let the head stick out, and you will get new plants. So there are 3 cuttings I put in one pot, and this is only 2 years old from root cutting. So roots of certain plants make cuttings. You got to know which. So the Chinese elm does easily, crabapple roots easily, wisteria roots easily. I don't think I know of many other varieties. Yes, the fig also roots very easily, the edible fig. I will show you that also as another little demonstration. Then there are these softwood cuttings where you use soft material, or you can use woody material. These Cotoneaster cuttings, they're only 6 months old, and Cotoneaster, by the way, roots ever so easily. You can see if you take a close-up view of this, it is a very thick piece of wood I put in. It's more than a 1/4 inch thick. It's thicker than a pencil, and yet it rooted so easily. Look at the roots on that. This is another Cotoneaster, not as thick, but it just shows I used actually the hard wood to make the cutting. So you can make cuttings from all these different ways. But let's begin first by showing you what softwood cuttings are. A softwood cutting is something like this. This is crassular, this is soft. You just stick in the soil without hormone rooting powder, and I guarantee you in about 2 weeks it should root. Now, this is a fig. This was made from a hardwood cutting, but if you wanted to make a softwood cutting, you would just use this soft material. This is all the material that has grown in the last 2 weeks. So you can just snip a bit off like that. That will grow again. Remove the leaves. Remove as many leaves as possible because you don't want the leaves to draw too much moisture. You may or may not dip this in hormone rooting powder. Stick it in soil and you get a new plant. So these are the easy ones. Let me show you in detail about the Chinese juniper cuttings, because Chinese juniper is one of the favorites for bonsai, and they grow very, very easily from cuttings. Now this is the Juniper chinensis San Jose, or the San Jose juniper. Some people call it the Californian juniper. This is a plant that we've made on its way to becoming a bonsai, and this plant is only, I would say, 5 or 6 years old. This is the same plant, same age. We don't grow it big because we keep it pruned all the time. If I had planted it after 1 year in the ground, it would be about 10 times as big. But I like to keep it dwarf and compact, so I keep them in pots. So that is the same age, but I've not wired that yet. And this is a 2-year-old cutting of San Jose, and this is something that I rooted only last September. I can root it as late as September. And I haven't taken it out, but I can assure you, look at the roots on that. So that has rooted in the last 6 months. And of course in the winter it didn't grow at all. So it just shows how quickly they root. So they root within about a month. And this is after 1 year, and this is after 5 years. So it's not that long to wait to produce a nice bonsai from cutting. So what do we do for cutting material? We have a lot of large plants on the nursery from which we do the cuttings, but I'll just show you what we do when we make a cutting. So this is a good example here, rather than go to the field and show you our big plants. Now, I'm going to take a bit off from here. So when you get a pruning like that, you can either make what is called a heel cutting, and a heel cutting is something that you would pull like that, and that's called a heel cutting. That is called a heel cutting. And then you clean it up, and then remove the lower leaves, and then you're ready to stick it in the soil. I'll talk about the propagating medium in just a minute. So that is a heel cutting. And where you've removed the heel, these little bits of callus or these tear marks, These, if you smear with rooting hormone powder, these could also root from there, so that could make a cutting. I will show you some typical Chinese juniper material that you can use for making cuttings. On our nursery, because we are pruning all the time, we literally get tons and tons of material. Normally these we just compost or throw on the bonfire and burn it, but sometimes I keep some of it and I propagate from it. So this is a typical end of a branch that we have pruned off from Chinese juniper. This is the Ito-Ogawa, the very fine foliage juniper. Now, what do you do with a piece of material like this? My advice is that you should never be too greedy. I know that when we propagate, we're trying to propagate because we want to have lots of the material, and you tend to get greedy. But don't be greedy by taking the hardwood. Some people think that by taking a hardwood you will get an instant piece of material like this, which will almost look ready to be bonsaied. It may strike, I'm not saying it won't strike, but it is less likely to strike. We use this hormone rooting powder. You can have a look at it, and there are many types on the market, and they all have this ingredient called IBA, indolyl butyric acid. And the powder form is quite good. If you use hardwood material like this, you need very strong rooting powder. So that would do. And I always believe in tearing it and getting the heel cutting like that. And you dip it in the hormone rooting powder, and it should root. But I wouldn't encourage you to use wood that is very hard. The best material to use is what we call young semi-hard material. So if you go higher up the branch, this is a softer bit. So you're using much thinner material. So as I say, don't be greedy and use the thick material, because the thickened material, the less likely they are to strike. The best material for making juniper cuttings is something like a matchstick or even like a toothpick thick. Wood that has just been grown in the current season and which has just begun to get hard. And you tear it off, and this is what we call a heel. You can see that's a heel. Then you clean the heel off by trimming it there, and you stick it in hormone rooting powder, and then we will stick it into the soil, which I will show you how to do in a minute. Now, the other popular thing is your Japanese maples. Now, this is that famous Shishigashira or lionhead maple, very desirable plant, and I don't like to throw any scrap of this away. I used this the other day to make the air layering, but the top side trimmed off. I didn't want too much foliage, so I have this material. If you look closely, this is a very, very good example of what we call semi-hard wood. That means the wood has just hardened. All this growth is this year's growth. In the last, I would say, 4 to 5 weeks, all this has grown. So it is still soft and still green. If you compare it to the old wood, that is brown, almost purple in color, so that is last year's growth, which has become too hard. You can strike it from cutting using the hardwood, but the chances of it rooting are less likely than this semi-hardwood or the new wood cutting. So again, I prefer to use a heel cutting. I tear away at the heel. That's it, I tear it away. So I get a little heel, remove the bottom branches, just leave maybe a pair of leaves. Very important to remove as much leaf as possible. Just leave 1 or 2 pairs of leaves. The reason being, if you have too much foliage, it will make such a lot of demands on the root system that it will dry the cutting out. So the less foliage, the better. Some people, the professional growers, if you have a very large variety or that has large leaves, they even cut off half the leaf. If you cut off half the leaf, it reduces the transpiration even more. And that is best shown maybe with the fig cuttings. Supposing this is a fig cutting, I will remove half the leaf so that the transpiration is only going to take place from just that part of the leaf. If you leave the whole leaf, it'll transpire. That means it'll lose too much moisture and it'll make the rooting more difficult. So that is the ideal cutting with the heel. Clean the heel up, and again you stick it in the hormone rooting powder, and that would be an ideal cutting. Ideal cutting. So you can use this for most materials. You can use it for Satsuki Azalea. Again, Satsuki Azalea, don't use the hardwood, use the new shoots that have grown. That is the secret. The new shoots are more likely to strike. So using this, I get about 95% strike rate. That means for every 100 cuttings I take, 95% will root. With junipers, I get about the same rate of success. These are the shoujo prunings that I did. Again, if you look closely, that is the old wood. This is the new wood. The new wood is really not soft, but it has just turned hard. And the cutting is like this. Maybe reduce the area of the foliage. Don't remove all the foliage, leave some of it, but reduce it by half and stick it in the rooting hormone, and that is your cutting. Now, those of you who are more knowledgeable will be wondering why I haven't showed the nodal cutting method, because you don't always have to use the heel cutting to strike a maple. Now, what is a nodal cutting? A nodal cutting is simply a cutting where you prune a branch off. Say if you prune this branch off and you cut that, that is what we call a nodal cutting. But where you cut it is very important. If I show you again on this Deshojo maple, I've just cut that off. That would be a heel cutting, but that's not a heel cutting. So I'm going to cut over there, but I don't cut anywhere. I cut it just below the potential leaf joint, or where I have removed the leaves. So just cut it below there at a slant, and that is what we call a nodal cutting. Again, reduce the leaves in size, stick it in, and that's what you get. So again, to reinforce you the principle, the nodal cutting, so that's Chinese elm, Ulmus parviflora, not Zelkova, and then remove the bottom leaves. There's no heel there, and I cut just below the junction. So that is what we call a nodal cutting. Okay, so those are the different ways of making it. Again, if I can show you with this miniature rose, I can either do a heel cutting by tearing off the heel. I still think the heel cutting is the most reliable. So where you can, just use the heel cutting. So you remove that, stick it in, and that's it. I'm now going to just show you, these are all examples of different cuttings. This is the Itoigawa juniper. This has just struck in the last 2 or 3 months. This was last year's cutting, and so it goes on. And they all root very easily. You've got to know what variety roots. Certain varieties like the Cotoneaster, you can use really hard wood, and you don't have to use very strong rooting powder either. So certain varieties are easy to strike. Roses are very easy. The conifers like the cryptomeria and juniper are more difficult. You can use many types of medium. There is no magic formula for the medium. What I have here, this is our standard base compost. That means we mix all the other materials like akadama, hyuga and things to it. So this is just 50-50 orchid bark and sphagnum peat moss. So it's a very open texture. So that's all I use. You can add sand to it. Some species you can root purely in sand, but I find that this is best to use. And you also notice that because we are a commercial nursery, we use these large propagating trays. These are not carrying trays. You can see they've got holes, so they are what we call propagating trays. We like to have good drainage. You mustn't stand it in water unless you're propagating willows. They have to have good drainage. So all these trays have a lot of holes at the bottom. So they're also very deep. So you fill it so that it's completely full to the top. Some people use vermiculite. Vermiculite is also very good, and I've also known people to use just ordinary bark. Bark is also possible. So anything that is an open texture will be good for making cuttings. So the other point I want to make is that you should plant the cuttings in as deep a tray as possible. If you use these seed trays, which are used for growing seeds, they're rather shallow. And because they're shallow, they don't have enough depth to put the cutting in. So fill it to the top so you have at least 2 inches depth. You can even use these squat pots. So a pot like this is about 3 inches deep, 3 to 4 inches deep. You can fill that up. The thing is to have a lot of mass. There are certain cuttings like this ficus. Every time I prune the ficus, I can get millions of cuttings. And this was just prunings that we picked off the floor. And ficus, as you know, those of our YouTube friends who live in the tropics will know that ficus grows ever so easily from cuttings. Look at that. Every single shoot has rooted. And then we just pot these up. So ficus is very easy. Some did not root, but I think it will form root. It will form root. See, there's a new shoot coming from there. So ficus is very easy. There's another box of these. And how do you tell when it's rooted? See, when it produces new growth like this, then you know that it has rooted. This is not dead, but it hasn't produced roots yet. But let's tip this out, and you can see, look at the roots on that. So these are ficus cuttings. Again, you see that hasn't rooted yet, but I'm not going to throw it away. Some of them have rooted. So the rooted ones I will just pot on. Don't break the roots. That's a lovely plant. And then that makes an individual plant. So a flower pot like this can be used for making quite easy cuttings. So with the ficus, we use quite hard wood. So we didn't use entirely soft wood, because I know that ficus is an easy species to propagate. So let's take this tree there and show you how we insert it. In fact, it's quite simple. So that's the very deep tray. And these are the cuttings I've already dipped in the hormone rooting powder. So I usually put it at a slant and as deep as possible. So I put it almost 3/4 of the length of the cutting I made, because the more contact it has with the growing medium, the more chance it has of rooting. So all these are going to be shoved deep into the compost at a slant so that I have more contact, and they should root. I usually keep the same species together because that makes an orderly way of producing cuttings. Also because the different species root at different rates. Juniper may take longer to root than a maple, and so on. So we want to separate it at the right time. And again, if I can show you, those of you who remember a video I did back in October, this is now 3rd week in May, will remember we did the program making bonsai from, I think, nursery material. I showed a very rare form of Alberta spruce. It was a picea of some kind. And those cuttings, like the cuttings we made in another program, were just stuck in this medium, and every single plant has rooted. Every single plant here has rooted. So it just shows how easy it is to root picea cuttings. So this is no big deal, very, very easy to root. I will just show you one more little trick, and that is to make the root cuttings from the edible fig. What I'm going to show you now is really not really cuttings, but they are just root cuttings. Now this lovely edible fig, Ficus carica, they have this habit of producing suckers from the roots. And if you leave all these suckers to grow, it will take away the nutrients or the goodness from the parent tree, and the top may not grow so well. So every now and then you've got to get rid of these suckers. So all these are actually self-made cuttings, root cuttings. And if you tease them, it's such a vigorous plant that I don't have to worry about the tree dying at this time, because I'm really just going to do a repot. Just to show you that I'm not cheating. So there are about 20 or 30 rooted suckers. They will all form beautiful little plants. And as I told you earlier, the Ficus carica also root very easily from hardwood cuttings, but these are just root cuttings. So you take the trouble, you see every one of them have self-rooted, so that would make a delightful little bonsai. So all these are in fact like root cuttings, but they are suckers. But if you planted the root of this tree, even a sliver of root like this, if you take that, see there's already root there, you put it in a pot with the head sticking out, it will form a new tree. So these are all the different methods of taking cuttings, although that's called a root cutting. But making cuttings will propagate your collection of plants very easily, and you get a lot of satisfaction making more and more material, and then you can train it in whatever way you wish. There you are. I hope you've enjoyed this video about taking cuttings, and the main thing is to have a go yourself. Never mind if you have failures. The thing is, the more you practice, the more confidence you'll get. Thank you very much.